Wonderful. Check, check, check. Am I coming through right, Debbie? Can you give me a thumbs
Yes.
up at least? Great.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. No, it is a pleasure. It is a pleasure to be with everyone and to, I guess we're finding these moments of real world and virtual connection and finding, I guess, elements of joy and nourishment from each in their particular way. So I'm going to try to keep myself from rambling too much by reading components, and then it'll open up into discussion as we go. So, so thank you for letting me participate in the discussion and help tease out some of the ideas and that are propositioned within the premise of the talk. I'm coming from the speaking from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. I pay my respects also to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who might be joining us this evening as part of this group. The fact that I work and make art and help others make art on stolen land is something that I keep in the forefront of my mind, and as I develop programs and work towards the future, especially in this new campus here where I'm sort of working at Collingwood Yards. That's really something that we dwell on. If my light goes off, it's because I'm in a room at these campuses that tries to save power. So I'm going to wave at various points. It's not to grab attention, it's to simply keep the light on here. So firstly, I thought we could enter the conversation as it's a real pleasure to be speaking with these other panelists. It's a real privilege for me to really, my role is really to pass the mic and try to set up a few zones of conversation in which these very wise creative people can give their perspective. So I thought first to talk about terms, right? So I thought it might be productive to think about terminology and the way we establish our various to establish our various perspectives before we get too far into the conversation. I've had a relationship with the term critical, right? So in this context about critical peer relationships, I've had a sort of a relationship with that developed through my experience in the controlled studio environment of art school, and I think that's a very particular thing. So I wondered, and I'm going to kind of ask you all to elaborate a bit on how we feel about this word, the word critical, and particularly as it applies to contemporary art practice. And I thought perhaps I can, in a sense, pass the mic to Ramesh first, because this sort of inquiry into terminology came up in some of our email exchanges before the talk, and so I wanted to sort of kick off and perhaps hear your thoughts on the term critical and the appropriate frameworks for its use in the context of art. And please don't let my setup for the question dictate where you go with it. But yeah, I just thought I'd pass the mic over and see what you thought.
No, that's good. No, I think it's really interesting when we think about these terms, and I think language is a really fruitful thing to start unpacking, because I think what I found, especially if you read a lot of art, you experience a lot of art, these terms get used so much, and I think a lot of the times they get divorced from I guess their meaning or the power of their application. And I think critical is one of those words. I think as contemporary artists or practitioners practicing in a kind of global context where we're aware of power imbalances and different plights of different peoples in the world, I think we're kind of expected to be critical in lots of capacities. And I think in the context of visual culture, I think one of the primary expectations around criticality is to be able to have a historical and ethical framework around what you're doing, essentially. And I think that's almost a baseline in which other models of criticality are positioned around when in this kind of making culture. I could elaborate on what that means, but I think others might have a perspective on that too.
For sure. Well, yeah. Maybe, I mean, again, please feel free to, for anyone else at any point to jump in. But I guess I've, well, and also, Elias, we maybe go on to you there, and of course you can respond as well to points that Ramesh has brought up there. But I thought it might be interesting to touch on your international perspective and experience, especially as someone who comes at this conversation as a poet and as a visual artist, and you're sort of known for those things, of course, in sort of various degrees. So I wondered, like, how and if the term critical is a term you find useful in your peer mentorship, mentee relationships, in either art form.
Thank you, Channon. Well, my understanding of critical conversations and peer critical conversations is going back to my experience of attending poetry circles while I was in Iran and Afghanistan, and I feel although there are so many similarities, but there are some differences in a way that there is like really open to conversations in a way. When you present a poem, you would get quite different different questions and also different feedback, and without so much of hesitation of you might get even offended by some of the for some of the comments. So, and in a way, it's like there's so much questioning happening rather than kind of judgment or even finding answers. And I mean, the way I find it like a really good critical conversation is to be really trying to move the work further and kind of challenge you, and then trying to make your idea more clear and kind of like make your work more richer in terms of expression or presentation. And somehow I feel like in at least like my experience in Australia, there's a bit of a sensitivity around and those critical conversations. There's been and many would hold some of those comments. Many would I mean, trying to be polite and safe and not offend you, which I find like I learned a lot from those who really honestly and kind of gave me quite sometimes harsh feedback, but I found them really, really interesting. I think for the moment that would be enough.
And I think you're right there to talk about those different environments and how I guess levels of criticality can be brought to those forums depending on the amount of trust one has in that group that's come together, and the amount of the way that a kind of a safe zone has been established when those groups come together. And I thought to come to Kaya's at the end of this section, I thought maybe there was a similarity in some of those. What would I say? Some of those peer groups that we seek out, because I guess I've found that I've gravitated towards more quite caring and supportive peer networks where I can bring a certain amount of vulnerability. It doesn't mean sometimes that doesn't mean that feedback is robust. But I thought, Kay, I wondered how you see this term critical in your peer relationships, and whether it's a framework you even relate to, I suppose.
Yeah, I do seek out caring and supportive peer networks. I guess, this stems from my early experiences of art school, where the cohort who I went through with, we formed a tight-knit group throughout our undergrad degree, and our lecturers were all quite nurturing and really encouraging. I feel that I do have peer relationships today that are quite similar to these early days. And when you're sharing your work with others, you are vulnerable. And I do share my work and ideas with peers who I feel safe with and who I allow myself to be vulnerable with. I trust and value their opinions and critical thinking toward my work. So I guess it's, about allowing myself to be vulnerable, but not fearful when peers do challenge the work that I make.
That's yes, I sense that, and I think that's quite a sincere thing that I think a lot of us sort of seek out in various ways in these groups. So I thought that's a really nice lead in, because I wanted to interrogate a little more the impact of art school, because I think in the context of Australia, this is a really sort of potent set of institutions. So as I commented in that first one, my formative experiences of peer relationships in the arts is intrinsically linked to communities of practice initiated at art school. And I think this is something just to kind of articulate and understand, because the impacts and influences of various schools in this country kind of needs to be addressed in various ways, in terms of not only this discussion about critical peer relationship, but also the way that the art world is sort of formed, structured, the kind of art histories that are dealt with, the economic structures that are sort of, there's my thing, laid out as the appropriate pathway for artists. So these can be positive breeding grounds for camaraderie, and provide access to facilities and knowledge networks and relationships with mentorships with artist teachers. But of course, they also act as gatekeepers for the art world, and I guess this really has impact on artists who can't access these facilities or these networks and resources, or who even feel unwelcome within these environments. Elias, I thought we could actually, given that there's kind of an interesting context for you at the moment, you kind of arrived in Australia just as I was heading out of my honours year in about 2007. So I suppose you'll probably bring a certain kind of perspective on the Australian academic context now through your various engagements with study and postgraduate. But now, of course, you're at the Chelsea College of Art, and I wonder. I wonder what that experience is of these different learning institutions, and how that affects your peer networks at this point in your life.
Thank you. Well, I did a master's degree at UniSA here in Adelaide, and one of the amazing sessions was every week we had silent critics. So everyone would show us their work, and the entire group would talk about it for an hour or more, and which I find it like really, really valuable, and which we didn't have that during the bachelor degree. At the Chelsea College of Art, which I was only for 6 months, and then I had to return because of the pandemic. But one of the great things they had was to every 2 months they would have a phase of kind of a development phase. So it would show your work, and then they would invite especially students from previous years, and they would come and comment about your work, and then also in a way sometimes you would have 2 or 3 chances of showing your work before the final exhibition. Say every 6 months we meant to have a big exhibition, and then at the end of the year, which I find it very interesting. And somehow perhaps in Adelaide, where I live, we had a few places where we had a space called as a projected space, where kind of to show your work in progress. But I feel we're still lacking that kind of platforms more to maybe in performing arts. There's more kind of acceptance of even receiving some funds for those development phase, and somehow I feel we need in visual arts as well. So one of the obviously places like London being a very big city, we had more broad perspectives and people coming from different places, and in London, in Adelaide is quite closed, and for me as an artist of color, I feel sometimes you receive some feedback, but they don't have maybe enough those reference points, especially those reference to the culture but in London that was quite different.
Very interesting. And I thought so when I'm linking to Kay next, I think some of the things you touched on in your previous point, I guess, are relevant to this section. But I guess maybe you've already kind of talked about potentially how those peer networks have sort of extended out from those studies at VCA, and I wondered maybe then, if I'm building on that, because we've already touched on that, I wonder, did those strategies of forming relationships mean that you've sought out kind of new kind of new communities of peers over time, depending on either the work you're making or the circumstances you're in? Or has it been, in a sense, just a long continuum of those original art school relationships? I wondered if you can comment a bit on that, Kay.
Yeah, I still am in contact with a couple of friends from art school, but in particular, I have a good friend who I made in undergrad, and he is still my art school bestie to this day. And, you know, our friendship spans 17 years, you know, this year. And I speak to him regularly about art and life. But I guess, you know, my community currently is, you know, the other studio artists at Gertrude. And, you know, we see each other almost every day. We have conversations in the corridor. Some artists, you know, obviously have tighter relationships with other artists, and we have conversations in our studios. But I guess my closest sort of network at the moment is the community at Gertrude.
And well, and I think that's something we'll touch on, especially when we get to the point of when we talk a bit more about the studio context, as maybe a very interesting example of where these peer relationships emerge, and maybe also some of the places where trust can be established, so that those critical conversations can be had in a way that, you know, opens up some potentially difficult terrain. Ramesh, I guess I wanted to talk again to see what your experience with, say, the UNSW was, and I think, you know, that just sort of reminded me, because I guess through a number of things, you know, you commented not only, I suppose, on potentially some of the friendship groups or the networks that came out of that, but also I guess it gives you access to scales of facility and these kind of things, which maybe still I guess mean they stay within the orbit of a practice over a longer period of time. I wondered if you could talk about the influences of that learning institution on your work. And I guess the peer relationships that have extended from that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about there, but I think if we speak maybe more structurally in a way, like if we start out and kind of move in, I think it's somewhat important to acknowledge that, you know, art school and tertiary education is, you know, the primary mode in which artists have vocational training. I'm not saying it's the only way, because there are other, you know, systems of learning and teaching and knowledge that are equivalent and have the same, you know, institutionally sanctioned things, or either culturally sanctioned ways of learning and teaching. But I think, you know, especially where we are, it happens to be that, you know, tertiary education is the primary way artists are trained. And I think it's actually important to think about the kinds of pedagogy and that, you know, universities often promote. And I think, you know, often, you know, universities, especially really large universities, talk about things like graduate attributes, and the terminology that's often used in these, you know, graduate terms like graduate attributes would be, you know, global citizens, ethical, critical comes up. And I think what's interesting about, you know, pedagogy is that, you know, there's an understanding that critical skills actually need to be developed. They don't just exist. So I think people need to actually be trained to engage critically, you know, with culture, with science, with anything really. And I think one of the goals of art education is to train people to engage critically with visual culture broadly. But I think if we actually think about what critical means, I think people can be a bit disturbed by the term critical, because I think people have this belief that it is about, you know, highlighting a positive or a negative attribute of an artwork, when I don't actually think it is. I think that's an element of criticality, but I think often criticality is being able to understand a framework of intention around what someone's doing, and then being able to engage with that from that position. And if I came back to that point about the fact that, you know, critical skills are actually things that have to be developed and trained, and, you know, given attention to over time, I think a really important part of being an artist is having some kind of filtration and not just accepting anybody's opinion on your work. And that's something I think, because, you know, like just from a human level, I think sometimes what people say about your work says more about them than you or the actual object in front of you. And I think being able to actually process engagement is another element of a critical conversation, which I think is really hard as an artist as well, because I think even if you're kind of doing, you know, geometric abstraction, I think most people's work is still personal. And I think there's this belief that, you know, some kind of comment about the artwork is a comment about the person. So there's this conflation of the artwork and the artist. So I think in some ways, there's also an element of unlearning that needs to happen when people start practicing professionally. Because I think in a university context, there's often a very hierarchical model where there's this lecturer that, you know, students often, you know, they believe, they'll take their word as gospel a lot of the time. When I think more like contemporary models of teaching are a bit more centered around peer exchange and acknowledging that, you know, you actually need generational, cultural, gender diversity as part of a discussion around artwork to actually allow some kind of critical framework to emerge. And I think my experience as an artist, a student and an educator has kind of revealed that, like if I'm, you know, in a classroom, I find it quite important to decenter myself as the teacher, you know, because, you know, you think historically about the way in which knowledge was transferred in places like, you know, and there was often a very hierarchical model, was that imparting wisdom. But I think the beauty about art practice is that, you know, engagement can be, you know, distributed from a number of levels. But I think what I took from art school the most is actually being able to find and select the few people whose critical opinions matter to you the most, and being able to engage with them primarily. And that sounds a little bit, I don't know, it might sound a little bit elitist, but it's probably more about acknowledging that I think artists and their works, I think, can often be very fragile. And, you know, sometimes you're making works in the studio, and I think you actually need to spend time developing meaningful relationships to have critical conversations, rather than, like, I'm not the kind of person who would go into a blind criticism with my work with people I don't know, for example. I'd kind of want a bit of context to the positions people were coming from. So that's that's what I took from art school. It was kind of being able to find like-minded people that I respected to engage with.
That's fantastic. What a great answer. I'm glad we got that on record. People can watch back and unpack the layers of that response. That was really wonderful. And maybe it does relate to kind of the next question in a way in terms of what kind of relationships to seek out. And I wanted to push back a little bit from the Academy to consider how we may have sought out connections with other practitioners, forming in the process other types of mentorships or apprenticeships or forms of working relationship that are based on intergenerational knowledge sharing. Elias, I thought maybe I was reading sort of various things that potentially might have been key moments of influence in the past and maybe at the moment in terms of engagement with other practitioners. And one of the notes that was wondered if you could comment a little bit on the encouragement that the artist Hussein Velamanish gave you in terms of initiating creative work, or perhaps confidence building in terms of setting out on a path. And the other point perhaps that Debbie mentioned was that you're collaborating with Khalid Sebsabi at the moment. I think Guildhouse is facilitating that process. And so I thought maybe there are 2 points in time that maybe I could ask you to comment on a little bit in terms of how those were influential relationships.
Yep. Yeah, actually, when I arrived to Adelaide in 2007, I wasn't really sure even to go to art school, and then quite accidentally I met Hossein, and an exhibition, and in a way, him being very welcoming, quite open to talk about art. And I did tell him like I love drawing and I'm doing some art, but not professionally. And even he invited me to his studio, and I think that kind of genuine encouragement really really helped me a lot to feel that actually I can bring my language into work. I can the stories I have there and the experiences I have are valued, and seeing his work and how especially he used text in a lot of his work, used poetry in his work. So that was really encouraging, and really and also even later we kind of formed that friendship in a way, and as Ramesh mentioned, like it's not in a way of one person is the master and another one learning from it. It's more of a friendship, and even I asked him to write me support letters, which is quite an important thing for grant applications. And I do know friends who are actually struggling to have those artists or lecturers to write support letters. And then also with Khaled Sabsabi, the same. It's been really great, that opportunity with Guildhouse. And I feel like sometimes my work is interpreted quite differently as I meant to. Somehow it's been kind of described as Islamic work, or if I use text, and many would say, oh, it might be Arabic, or is it has any relation to their religion. And for example, I have a body of work which is called Halal, and although it has that very small reference to the religion text, but it's entirely different work. And for someone with someone like Khaled, literally he would understand my work immediately, and he kind of having those lived experience of if we using this text, what does it mean, and so that's been really confidence building, at the same time feeling that those conversations about the ideas behind the work, because you feel that you both understand what's happening in Middle East, and as lots of our work are have that similar themes. So that's I mean, maybe I get some of the feedback from other curators in terms of the techniques and in terms of the mediums, but in terms of the themes and the ideas behind the work, I feel much more I feel much more I get much more from someone like Hossein and Khaled.
Wonderful. I was just plotting out how we might jump on from that and make the most of our remaining minutes. We started a little later, but not that much later that I can indulge in in everything I'd love to get across today. So I thought maybe I could blend a couple of these final points. The last sort of zone talks a bit about studios, and I wanted to perhaps ask Kay a little bit about both forms of mentorship, but also potentially how that very specific environment of Gertrude has provided a kind of a context for, I guess, for not only the peer relationship she's also talked about, but also, I suppose, the infrastructure of a site like Gertrude as a studio context. So I'm going to kind of blend that a little bit and ask Kay a little bit about perhaps the particular support that a place like Gertrude provides to artists during, say, a pandemic like the one that I know was quite impactful. We just heard a little bit before before we came live about how your residency was extended. But I wonder, with that site, and I wonder what support is provided to artists in a site like that during a moment like that. And I wonder if it again creates a certain kind of context with these kind of critical peer discussions, potentially mentorship aspects kind of flow through a site like that. Would you mind talking a bit more about that context in terms of a studio environment?
Yeah, sure. I feel that Gertrude is an incredibly supportive environment, and it has a lot to do with the culture that the directors and staff of the organisation have created for us. 2020 was such a horrendous year, and the pandemic has been very disruptive to our studio practices and working lives, like it has been and continues to be for the rest of the world. Gertrude fully subsidised our studio fees from April to December in 2020. They also, created opportunities for artists by, commissioning posters and online writing through to running artist-led Zoom education workshops, and also supported a conversational podcast to, reconnect artists and reduce the loneliness during the worst parts of quarantine and social isolation. We also had weekly catch-ups on Zoom every Friday afternoon during lockdown. So, we were still very much in contact with each other, and, not physically seeing each other, but, online. So, yeah, but we're back in the studios now, and we had a brief sort of break, which was, I think a couple of days, but it has been quite disruptive. But as I mentioned before, our studio residencies have been extended for 12 months. So we get a bit of extra time to, keep developing the work that we're making within the walls of our studios, and
Wonderful, thank you for that insight, and I think it does kind of continue to relate to this kind of context in which these practices and conversations and critical relationships are sort of fostered. And I think you can kind of bring critiques to kind of these various power dynamics behind each of the settings, whether they're the way that studio complexes are embedded within contemporary art, whether universities and their structures have certain levels of privilege but I think actually we've kind of teased out some of that, and Ramesh, you certainly gave a kind of a multifaceted perspective into those contexts. I wanted to maybe just ask to one more of Ramesh as well, because of trying to space out our perspectives here, and I kind of blend a little bit again as well. I'm trying to make sure that we can try to get a certain kind of amount out of this last kind of question, and it's a bit again about terminologies in some ways. So the question that I'm kind of going to try to kind of blend in was asking about talking about mentorships and thinking about whether in fact terms like that actually suggest a certain power dynamic which is now which there are potentially other models of, and I wondered whether that might blend into the final point as well. So I could have kind of a conversation about whether forms of mentorship are now, what would I say, become kind of complicated or obsolete in terms of how contemporary peer relationships are sort of being developed today. I maybe thought maybe I could just kind of open up maybe a little bit with Ramesh about that kind of, what would I say, the relevance, I suppose, of these kind of terms at the moment, and whether, in fact, we need to find new ways of describing these kind of relationships to better represent the power dynamic shifts that are happening. I wondered, even though it's a bit of a complex one, I wondered maybe you could just respond to the kind of that premise. I wonder.
Yeah, I think there's a few things I want to say. I think the most important thing to kind of understand is that I think there is always high demand for artists to engage with people, other artists who have, in their minds, more experience than them. And I think that's essentially what it comes down to. It's about the fact that there's mystification all around all these different aspects around a professional art psychology. It's people don't really understand how some artists are represented by certain commercial galleries, how some artists get Australia Council grants, how some are on the cover of magazines. And I think artists at an earlier stage in their career can actually identify artists who are maybe at a stage that they would like to be at. So they have experience, and another word is cachet. And I think access to that specific kind of knowledge is incredibly hard to come by in a formalized kind of way. And if we think about the presentation of art, one of the most formalized relationships we have is between artist and curator. However, I think the difference between an artist to an artist versus an artist to a curator is the fact that, I think, art practice is not always, I think there's, for example, there are like mystifying things in art practice, like intuition is core to lots of people's artwork and how they make things. But, if you kind of said something like that to someone doing an interview, or, you're trying to come across a certain way and provide, some traction for your work curatorially, you don't want to sound airy-fairy. So I think artists, engaging with artists is something that's in demand. So artists have different levels of experience. The other thing that I've found, though, is that I think lots of successful artists are actually find it quite rewarding to develop relationships with artists who are earlier stages in their career. And I think that's primarily due to the fact that I think being an artist, I think lots of successful artists love art. Like they want to go to galleries and see amazing artwork, and that's what they're doing in their spare time. And I think acknowledging that the generations are below you are the ones that are going to be in those galleries, and that's what you kind of want to nurture. And I think what's interesting about creative or visual cultures is that there has historically always been some kind of presence of this kind of intergenerational exchange, or a valuing around intergenerational exchange. But I think in terms of terminology, like I feel quite uncomfortable with the term mentor because I don't think the other person should be passive in any way. I think there needs to be an element of challenge sometimes, or just acknowledging that, yes, they may have some kind of mentor position, but you don't have to listen to them, if you know what I mean. It's not up to them to dictate what you do, but I think some guidance, some advice is good. But in terms of terminology, if we go back to that, I think another key term that is kind of important when we're looking at this is this other term which gets chucked around a lot, which is professional development. And I think there's an expectation that mentorship leads to professional development. And when we think about what that is, I think it depends on what the artist is aiming to do, what step A is and what step B is. And I think finding people who have experience with that and actually understand those kinds of invisible processes around getting from A to B is actually sometimes the only thing that gives you insight into how that happens.
Amazing. I don't even want to get in the way of like letting that kind of stew, that kind of comment at the end. And maybe, Debbie, we could just kind of see what else comes through the questions. Would that be a way for me to get out of the way of rambling towards the end or spoiling that note?
Not at all. I note that Melinda Rackham would like to ask a question and turn on her mic. Would you like to reveal yourself?
Oh, here I am. Hello. Yeah, I've got a dog being naughty, so something might happen during this. I won't have to do that. Anyway, thanks. Great conversation. I'm a different generation than a lot of the rest of you, the older generation. And, you know, as people have been saying, that intergenerationality is like so important. And yes, so important. And when I went to art school, you know, I felt like I was just like a little sensitive petal. It was like if anyone said anything about my work, I'd be in, you know, I'd be crying and running away. And I've really had to toughen up. When I started to travel overseas, as has been spoken about, I was horrified at how people spoke to each other at conferences and exhibitions. But I realized that criticality, that feedback is vital, absolutely vital. And I've just written a book with Elvis Richardson, who I went to art school with 35 years ago. So, you know, great peer, you know, keeping in touch with the peers, on gender disparity in the arts. And I think when we're talking about support and peer criticality, there are two different things. It's like you need support, emotional support, but criticality is incredibly important from an outside source that's not you, and that is not, I guess it's who do you want your audience to be? Sorry, this is a long rambling question. Who do you want your audience to be? Can your mum understand it? Does it mean something to someone in the street, or do you have to have a PhD to understand this art practice? And it's like getting feedback from the audience that you want to reach with your practice. And I just want to say one more thing to all the women. If you're not getting offered opportunities and you're seeing men getting offered them, it's not you, it's the system. And all the men here are going to get offered twice as many opportunities and make twice as much money as the women just because they're men. So you need to support each other in that. Over and out for me. Sorry, that wasn't a question. That's just throwing something else in about the way an art system works. And that's the way it works in Australia.
Yes, and I think in fact, adding that towards this context of critical conversations is really vital. So I think that's a really valuable perspective to bring in, and also just add to the portfolio of kind of the kind of perspectives on this point that we've had today. So yeah, thanks, Debbie, and thanks again for the comment.
Thank you both. We have another question from Sarah asking, how do you learn to give good critical feedback? And, oh, hang on, your computer's gone a bit funny there, Sarah. And what do you think makes productive, helpful, critical discussion? I think you throw that out to all the speakers. I actually
wondered if Alias, like if you had because you talked a little bit about the kind of what would I say, the cut and thrust of feedback around poetry, and I wondered if you had a comment about that question.
Yeah, I feel if someone giving a constructive feedback, you kind of feel it as well. If it's genuine enough and it's honest, it's you know, I have a while I was in London, I met a friend where she kind of sometimes even swore at me, kind of saying, look, this work is good, but why it's lacking in these parts. And I do know that she doesn't want to hurt me. She wants, you know, sometimes she's being harsh because she likes me more. She wants me to saying, look, you need to develop further. And I think as Ramesh mentioned, I also learned a lot from those conversations out of university or out of the formal space, you know, say a conversation over a beer or a tea, and then that friendship kind of helped me to understand that this person actually is very wants me to grow. So I think being open and being honest and not judging the person or the work just in a way, I think it's starting with questions. Lots of questions would be best way.
I actually also wondered if Kay, we've talked a little bit about the kind of critical feedback or environment that I think you and I like crave ourselves. But I wondered how do you interact with people when you're giving critical feedback? Are you likewise very kind, or do you bring a sort of a are you a much harsher critic than you would like to get yourself?
I feel like I'm still learning, you know, how to really give, you know, critical, constructive feedback that would, you know, obviously help an artist or, you know, yeah, whoever I was giving feedback to. But I feel like I am quite, you know, not soft, but more encouraging towards, yeah, I do work in a university. So yeah, I feel like, you know, in terms of, in relation to how I went to art school and what was valuable for me in terms of, you know, our lecturers, and it was about being, you know, encouraged and nurtured. So I guess I just take the same stance with, yeah, my students.
Awesome. Thank you, Debbie. Ramesh, did you have anything to add to that point? Sorry, I was going to hand it back.
That's all right. But I think what I've kind of learnt over the years is that I think if you're an artist and you're seeking critical feedback, I actually think you also have a bit of responsibility as the artist seeking the feedback to actually have questions, right? So like there are different like ways you can actually invite people into the work. You know, if someone said to me, do you like this? If I said to them, do you like this? I think the question would be, why do you like this? If you know what I mean? I think there's actually a bit of to actually gather the critical feedback, I think, from another person. I think the artist also has to develop skills in engaging with that person, to actually be able to understand the perspectives they're coming from. And I think the primary way of getting the right feedback is understanding what are the right questions to ask. If you just invited someone randomly to your studio and said, can you give me critical feedback? That's a bit like, sure. But if someone said to me, you know, I think my use of color is registering in ways that are tonally not how I want them to. Can you come and engage with my paintings based on their color or my use of color? I'd be, you know, I think that's a very clear framework that's provided. And so I think in a way, like to get the feedback you want, it's about, you know, reflecting and thinking and being able to articulate and with clarity some questions.
Excellent.
Channon, can we throw that question back to you as a curator and director at BUS in terms of how do you, if you don't mind, how do you engage in providing feedback and I guess especially when artists are at the point of installing an exhibition, there's quite a lot of vulnerability and uncertainty and excitement, and it's quite a special relationship to be working with an artist at that time. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
And so I suppose, again, I think a lot of the ways that I'm most comfortable talking with artists in that context is as another artist in a crit style scenario. So talking in ways that are enthusiastic about work and that test out different approaches to whatever we're playing with in the gallery. So whether that is you know, following a certain sort of, you know, narrative of critique as in terms of the way that formal elements are presented, what it makes me experience as a viewer, the way that exhibition design has been thought through, and potentially how this encounter will be thought of in many different ways. And so I think going on tangents of kind of I guess, yeah, kind of exploring the different ways that their work is being deployed, and potentially the way that that's sort of read by a viewer. But and so I think my approach is generally to be again really supportive in that context. And if I am giving if there's a process of critique or critical feedback, it's done through a kind of an exploration of an enthusiastic exploration of what's being presented, how it could be viewed, and potentially what could be done if you're hitting brick walls in terms of different aspects. It's definitely talking it through in that way, rather than potentially a mode which, you know, which some people are more comfortable with, which is to give confident advice, right? This should be gone from this space. This is not working. That's not the way that I would approach it. More to say that this is, you know, potentially this is what this element does. This is what I'm seeing in this work as a viewer, as another artist looking at this. I'm puzzled by this. This is what makes me think. If you add this, I'm going to think about this. Do you want that to happen? And potentially it could, or potentially you might want to recalibrate in that way. The more difficult process is, in some ways, to give which I know is a very valuable thing, is to give critique around the open call process, and in terms of successful or unsuccessful applications. And I think that's a process that's fraught with emotion, and of course often a very difficult one to give authentic and genuine and useful feedback. It may be a conversation for another day, but I think that I just wanted to open up that's something that really, I think anyone who manages an open call continues to wrestle with, how to give good critical feedback on those processes.
Thanks so much. And I think that's a really interesting point about open call. And Ramesh also mentioned, I guess, being able to accept feedback, or knowing what kind of framework you want that feedback in. And especially for open calls, many people will respond at a time as soon as they've received a no, and be very quick to write a response asking exactly, you know, what feedback they can be given, but not necessarily provide a framework for what specifically they want to know. So I think that's a really interesting point. So thank you both so much. We do have another question from Belle Howden. How can we think about or enact criticality joyfully, playfully, with levity? I'm going to throw that out to you all.
I will see if anyone has an initial response about that.
I saw Ramesh smile, so I wonder if.
I think humor is one of the good things that can be brought into like critical conversations. That's something that I've experienced quite a lot, and I think like that presence of laughter is a really amazing thing to flatten things out. Although I will say that sometimes humor is not appropriate in every context, but that's I think the other thing that I think is interesting is that I think if something's hard or difficult or somewhat stressful, I think it can still be enjoyable and playful. I don't think because I think a lot of the time people will be like I think most artists aren't enjoying their work if it's easy to do, if you know what I mean. So I think sometimes that framework of joyful or playful can be thought of a bit more deeply as well.
Thank you, Ramesh. We have some thank yous, which is very lovely. And we have another question from Paddy Sheehaid, who has a gallery called Praxis Gallery in Adelaide. And she asks, Channon, what do you do when the art isn't working and you're only a couple of weeks or days out of the opening night? That's a curveball, Channon.
No, but it's an interesting one in the sense that potentially people it's a tricky one, because there are relationships with say gallerists or people who are in the position of organizing spaces that I think there can be just what's needed, something that where the person at the gallery can be trusted to kind of like to sort of be able to drastically reshape a show. You can rely on them to kind of say, let's reverse and head a different way on this project. And I think for me, okay, so maybe I approach this from the context of an artist-run space and understanding that generally our role is to provide an architecture on which artists can present work on their own terms and in their own way, in ways that they feel comfortable with, or also that their relationships with the people running the gallery is as equal as possible. There are obviously hierarchies present, but that my role is as a support structure and as a force of encouragement and enthusiasm and kind of trying to provide, I guess, elements that are needed. So, in a sense, if the artist is sort of, if the artist is unhappy with where the show is at, that's where a kind of a process not only of critique but also of enthusiasm, praise, and a kind of I guess perhaps a way of working out what the issue is by talking around it, talking about practice, talking about their work, and finding kind of perhaps tangents of the work which actually have become clouded, I suppose, in terms of a way towards a project. And actually, often it's because of other pressures that are getting in the way of what is in fact the core of the practice. Whether that's concern about, you know, the presentability or the professionalness of the install, or that you're worried that actually that you're trying to position yourself for commercial representation, and in fact that's kind of making your work be presented in a way that's totally alien from its from what your kind of your conceptual basis is, or your formal basis. So I think, you know, I guess I try not to think about in terms of success or failure of shows, but whether the artist in a sense is happy with the way it's headed. And I think our way is to sort of, in a sense, champion the choices that the artist makes in those projects, and say, no, it's not. You're judging this in a way from your perspective, either if you're say bringing a curatorial eye to it as a tastemaker that says this artist is a good artist, or this artist is sort of, you know, still has some work to do before they're right. So I think our role is not to be that person, but to try to support the artist to pursue a tangent of practice and be happy with that when it comes to the public.